This is the story of a war that was not officially acknowledged and the men who fought it anyway. It covers the operations of Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, more commonly known as MACV SOG, and the classified missions into neighboring Laos and Cambodia. It also follows one soldier whose service in that unit placed him in some of the most dangerous fighting of the Vietnam War. But before the Medal of Honor was awarded, and before the details became public, there was a mission on December 30th, 1968, that nearly ended with the loss of an entire force. MACV SOG was established on January 24, 1964. It operated under Military Assistance Command Vietnam, but its missions extended beyond the officially recognized battlefield of South Vietnam. While conventional American units fought inside the South, MACV SOG teams crossed into bordering countries and conducted operations that were publicly denied. The purpose of these missions was to gather intelligence and disrupt the movement of North Vietnamese forces along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The trail was not a single road. It was an extensive network of jungle paths, truck routes, storage areas, and staging points that stretched through Laos and Cambodia. Through this network, weapons, ammunition, fuel, and entire combat units moved south into South Vietnam. Airstrikes targeted sections of the trail, but bombing alone could not fully disrupt it. Confirmation on the ground was required. That responsibility fell to small reconnaissance teams. MACV SOG reconnaissance teams were deliberately small. A typical team consisted of 3 American Special Forces soldiers and several indigenous fighters, often Montagnard or Nung troops. The American team leader was designated the 1-0. His assistant was the 1-1. The radio operator was the 1-2. Indigenous personnel carried additional ammunition, demolitions, and radios. Missions could last several days, and the teams operated with limited support once across the border. When discovered, these teams often faced larger North Vietnamese forces operating along the supply routes. Engagements could escalate quickly. Extraction depended on helicopters entering contested airspace under fire. Some extractions were successful. Others resulted in additional casualties. Operations into Laos were commonly referred to by the internal code name Prairie Fire. Missions into Cambodia were often designated Daniel Boone. These designations were not publicly acknowledged at the time. Officially, American ground forces were not conducting combat operations in those countries. Approximately 2,000 Americans served with MACV SOG during the Vietnam War. Many were wounded, some more than once. Others were killed or listed as missing in action from operations conducted beyond South Vietnam's borders. Details of these missions remained classified for years after the war ended. Sergeant First Class Robert L. Howard was one of the men assigned to a MACV SOG team. Howard enlisted in the United States Army in 1956 at the age of 17, and he later earned his Ranger tab. After completing the Special Forces qualification course, he was assigned to the 5th Special Forces Group as a Green Beret. He deployed to Vietnam during the early years of the conflict and conducted advisory and unconventional warfare missions. During his earlier tours, Howard was wounded multiple times in combat and returned to duty after each injury. His record reflected repeated exposure to enemy fire and sustained participation in direct engagements. By 1968, he had developed a reputation within his unit as a dependable non-commissioned officer in combat situations. His assignments included reconnaissance support and reaction force missions. Reaction forces were used when reconnaissance teams were compromised and required immediate reinforcement or extraction. These missions frequently meant inserting into active firefights. In late December 1968, a MACV SOG reconnaissance team operating near the Laotian border made contact with a larger North Vietnamese force. The team reported heavy engagement and mounting casualties. An A reaction force was assembled to provide assistance and recovery of the team. Howard was assigned to that force. On December 30th of '68, choppers carrying the reaction force approached the area where the reconnaissance team had last reported contact. As the aircraft neared the landing zone, they began taking enemy fire. The insertion was met with resistance from the start. Once on the ground, they immediately encountered sustained small arms and grenade fire. Enemy troops were positioned on surrounding terrain and began pressing the perimeter. The landing zone was not secure. Howard was wounded early in the engagement when grenade fragments struck his hands and legs. Despite his injuries, he remained engaged in the fight. He assisted wounded personnel and continued returning fire as enemy troops attempted to flank the position from elevated ground. Several members of the force were killed during the initial phase of the engagement. Others were wounded as the perimeter came under increasing pressure. An inbound helicopter was shot down near the contested area, further complicating the situation. The battle escalated as additional North Vietnamese troops moved into the fight. What had begun as a rescue mission became a defensive engagement to prevent the reaction force itself from being overrun. Howard moved through exposed areas to reach wounded men and pull them to relative cover. Enemy fire continued from multiple directions, and air support was requested to relieve pressure on the perimeter. Strikes were directed close to friendly positions in order to disrupt advancing enemy forces. The fighting continued for several hours. Enemy troops repeatedly attempted to close the distance. Howard continued assisting in the defense and helped mark positions for extraction aircraft despite his injuries. When helicopters returned under covering air support, extraction occurred under continued enemy fire. Surviving members of the force were loaded and evacuated from the area. Howard was evacuated for medical treatment following the mission. He had sustained multiple wounds during the engagement, including grenade fragments and small arms injuries. For his actions on December 30th, 1968, Robert L. Howard was awarded the Medal of Honor. He was presented the award on March 2nd, 1971. The citation recognized his repeated exposure to enemy fire while rescuing wounded personnel, his leadership during sustained contact, and his direction of air support under heavy pressure. Howard was one of the most decorated soldiers of the Vietnam War. His service record included multiple Valor Awards from previous engagements. He continued serving in the United States Army after Vietnam and later retired. Many of the operations conducted by MACV SOG remained classified for years. Cross-border missions were not widely discussed at the time they occurred. The men who carried out those assignments operated in areas that were officially denied, and in many cases their actions were not publicly known until long after the war had ended. Howard passed away on December 23, 2009, at the age of 70, and was buried at Arlington National Cemetery on February 22, 2010.